Okay, so here is our second of the four little videos about the different sociological perspectives. In this video, we're going to be looking at and talking about the conflict theory. The conflict theory sometimes is kind of the flip side of the coin to the functionalist perspective, in the fact that rather than seeing how everything works together, this theory assumes that behavior, looking at social behavior is best understood when you look at the conflict or the tension between competing groups. Looking at how groups are fighting to get to resources, how there's those underlying tensions, how some groups are being oppressed, how some are the haves versus the have-nots. When we're looking at this theory, if you have a foundation in Karl Marx, you'll very clearly see his link to this theory. Though Karl Marx was not a sociologist, sociology has adopted him, made him his own, and he is considered to be the founding father of this perspective. Now, one of the things that he really brought to sociology is by looking at different groups, seeing the divisions in society, recognizing that there are different classes, and that's what he looked at was really social class. And he looked at it in terms of the working class and the class of owners, capitalist owners, the fancy term being the bourgeoisie. So he noticed that one class was able to exploit another class. Today, it's a lot broader. We see it in terms of race. We can see the divisions in terms of sexual orientation. Disability is another kind of big area that we're seeing it in. But you can really look at different groups of people and just really see how those dynamics play out in terms of one group exploiting another group, or one group not having access to resources that another group does. Again, Marx talks about two different social classes, to keep it simple. That's all we're going to talk about. And he talked about in terms of the bourgeoisie, which is the capitalist class. They own the means of production, which means they either own factories or they own the goods that were necessary to make goods. They owned, the resources, whether that would be, raw trees or land, whether that was the gas, the oil, things like that. And their goal is to purchase labor. They're not doing that work for themselves. Rather, they hire somebody to make those goods that they sell at a profit. And the reason that they can make a profit is because they're not paying enough in wages. They're not paying fair wages. And in fact, their goal is to pay as little as possible so that they can keep as much of it as possible. The proletariat, on the other hand, are the working class, and they have to sell their labor to bourgeoisie. They have to sell their labor to make money to pay their bills, to have a living. Now, their primary interest is always to increase their wages. They can recognize that they're not making enough and that they need to make more. Now, Marx argued that the only way that they could raise their wages to better their position in the world is to work together. Okay, so Marx had a different view on capitalism. We're very comfortable with capitalism here in the United States. We believe capitalism is probably the best economic form, though we're hearing more and more dissent about that. But Marx thought he believed in dialectic change. He believed that one system would overthrow to another system, which would give way to another system, that over time things would become bad and that workers would have to overthrow the system again. Anyway, at the lowest level of those systems is where he placed capitalism. However, he did recognize that capitalism does allow for the efficient use of resources, and that, a lot of innovation comes from capitalist systems. However, he argued that it was an inadequate economic system because what happens is that the wealth becomes very concentrated and that the proletariat, the workers, become increasingly impoverished. Maybe you can see that in our society today. Even though our society isn't giving way, we obviously you should be able to recognize that the rich continue to get richer and the poor are getting poorer. To make that change, it requires what he called class consciousness. That's where you recognize how you're being oppressed, and you recognize that the other people who are like you. And this is necessary for social change because that's the breeding grounds for social movements and working together to overthrow the system. Now, when you start talking about overthrow systems, you're talking about something that's really quite radical. And the reality is that the conflict perspective is radical. It believes in change, even if it's forced change. So it can be radical at times. Unfortunately, false consciousness often holds people back. Hopefully that didn't go in the middle of something just popped up on my screen. Hopefully it didn't go on your screen too, but I'm just going to keep moving forward and hopefully that's not too tacky. But unfortunately, false consciousness holds the oppressed back because what happens is that they buy into the ideology of the system. Here in the United States, for example, we tend to buy into the idea that the reason why people are poor is because of their own doing. They made bad choices in their life rather than maybe recognizing that sometimes the systems are in our society are made in such a way that it makes it very hard that if you're born into poverty, that if you go and get your high school degree, it's unlikely that that's enough to get you out of poverty. And so what we see is that quite often um, people who are born into poor families continue to live in poverty, but believing that they have equal opportunity to be successful. Now that was in the past, and when the conflict perspective is looking at the world, they're not just limited on such little, like just social class, but rather they're looking at it in terms of the broader picture. So some of the basic tenets that you'd want to walk away with in terms of understanding conflict theory is that there is competition over limited resources, and those resources are pretty broad in terms of what they can be. It's much more than just money. I mean, it can be a lot of different things. It could be access to good education. Today, we're hearing a lot about the use of police force. So it could be that why is it that the police are policing in our neighborhoods and arresting our people of color at higher rates than what whites are being arrested? Resource, I guess, in terms of not having a criminal record and not being in jail. In terms of this theory, when you're trying to understand it, a lot of times if you think about it in terms of power, you'll really get this theory. Like, how do people get power? How do they stay in power? How do they use that power in a way that subjugates other people? How are they using it in a way that's oppressive? So a big driving question for this theory is who benefits and at whose expense? So again, I said that there are a lot of different ways to understand inequality for this theory. So you can look at social class. That's definitely a huge one. In fact, a lot of times what you'll see is that these are all kind of intertwined, right? The term that's been used, but that's used for that is intersectionality, that we see these kind of, like some things give us privileges and other things are issues of inequality. So social class, race, gender, sexual orientation are all major areas of inequality. It doesn't have to be limited to that, but those are kind of the big ones. This theory does tend to be a big picture, macro level, but it can also look at small scale relationships. You can see how the dynamics in the workplace in particular, when we're talking about organizations, how that plays out at a much smaller micro level. This theory is really good at explaining those issues of inequality. There we go. Trying to make myself full screen. Anyway, it's really good at looking at inequality, understanding oppression, who's being oppressed. If you wanted like a today's application, because it's all over the news. You can't ignore policing. And so we can say that you can actually recognize that people working together, having a shared consciousness, that maybe people have come to a class consciousness in terms of policing and what it's doing to our society, and that people are working together in a social movement driven by Black Lives Matter. But people, coming together and demanding change may lead to change, and that it has major issues of inequality, that we can point to statistics that show that people of color are much more targeted in terms of what neighborhoods are policed and ultimately who's used force on, sometimes when there's no weapons or anything on behalf of the person. um, that's dealing with that force. So, major issues of inequality, conflict theory is a great theory to use. And we're going to be talking about it in terms of how that plays out in organizations the rest of the semester. Okay, so that's a wrap. Please make sure you go and do the activity that's linked to this.